It's 1 o'clock. So welcome to this Govn365 webinar with Dr. Juliet Bourke on diversity of thought and how it can improve the impact of boards and executive teams. So in terms of if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through, and we'll drop in some questions as and when they come up. Before we get started, just wanted to share what Govn365 does. So our purpose is to amplify the collective potential. So what does that mean? It means we help ensure the executive team and the board are aligned and focused on the areas that are really going to deliver sustainable value beyond just profit. And that's not always the case. A lot of the times, without our help, they think they're aligned, but they're not. Through our personal approach and the software platform, we firstly aim to get the whole team and executive to understand and align on the organisation's current state. Then we get you aligned on the key focus areas that will add the most value, and then we partner with you to help unlock that through coaching and resources. One of the things we commonly uncover is blind spots, so areas that you were not aware of. So if you don't know your blind spots, you're putting your organisation at risk. So getting us to work with your executive team to help uncover and help mitigate that will reduce your risk. I'm also really pleased to announce that we've started a collaboration with Weave Group. So Weave Group is committed to supporting modern New Zealand leaders by providing two unique programs: the Business Leaders Groups, a monthly small group program for chief executives and senior leaders committed to their personal and business development, and the Leadership Development Program, an industry-leading curated program that is open to the public and run over 6 months for senior executives and emerging leaders. One of the areas we help you understand is your governance diversity. People may have skills matrices that they use. Have you got the right mix of capability, experience, and leadership skills and demographic balance to get better diversity of thought? Today, I have the great pleasure of chatting with Dr. Juliet Bourke, an expert in this area, who's a professor of practice in the School of Management and Governance in the Business School at UNSW, University of Southwest? No?
New South Wales.
New South Wales, sorry, right. As well as a global workplace advisor and board member. So in February, she was appointed the inaugural independent chair of the New South Wales Parliamentary Advisory Group on bullying, sexual harassment and serious misconduct. She is renowned for her thought leadership, regularly publishing in the Harvard Business Review, and you can check her out on TED, and earning numerous global accolades. Her latest book, Which Two Heads Are Better Than One, which I've read and researched for this, Extraordinary Power of Diversity of Thinking and Inclusive Leadership, explores the transformative impact of diverse thinking and inclusive leadership. So welcome, Dr. Juliet. Fantastic to have you on the webinar.
Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Excellent. So firstly, I wanted to start with your definition of diversity. So when you talk about diversity in your book, what do you actually mean?
I'm actually referring to two kinds of diversity. There is the sort of visible diversity, which is what we often talk about, which is the way that we often look similar or different to another person. So that sometimes that's called demographic diversity. But the diversity that I was primarily focused on the book was diversity of thinking. So how do we ensure that people around us think differently so that we're not working in an echo chamber? So two aspects: visible and invisible diversity. Diversity of thinking was a primary. And then what I wanted to do was put the two together. Is there a relationship between invisible and visible diversity?
So coming on to diversity of thought specifically, you talk about diversity of thinking being the polish that makes the group shine. I'd like to go through just each of the 4 areas that you identify that are important. But before we get into that, what are the benefits on better diversity of thought? Because we hear a lot about diversity inclusion, and most groups I see struggle to really just get more females on the group. So they're not even past stage 1. What's your views on the 4 areas, and then the key benefits why people should take action in this area?
Maybe let me name the 4 areas that I think it's helpful to focus on, and I'll talk to benefits, and then maybe we can come back again. But the 4 areas I think are important to think about: composition on a board, and composition in terms of diversity of thinking. And I can talk to that because I think what I have done is help define what we mean by diversity of thinking. The second thing is to think about the structure with which we have conversations. we're very enamored of random brainstorming, which is the idea that anyone can speak up for as long as they want to speak up. And that sort of democratic feeling is how we best elicit ideas. And in fact, a bit more structure to it is helpful. The third thing is the way that we try and mitigate biases, and biases that limit our perspective. We all have biases that privilege the way that we currently think rather than keeping us open to other people's ideas. And then the last one is inclusive leadership. So if you're a leader within a group, what responsibility do you have? And how do you make that group behave more inclusively? But as to the benefits, if I'm focusing then on diversity of thinking, I mean, it's very easy to say what we're trying to do is not do groupthink, and we can think of many corporate examples that have just done groupthink and followed down a trail of destruction. But then the question is, can we quantify that? Can we say what diversity of thinking is? And then secondly, if we do know how to define it, then what would be the value in pursuing that? And what I was showing through my own research and other people's research as well is that effectively you are trying to increase the innovative potential, value creation in a sort of how do I add in terms of innovative thinking? And that's about 20%. So it's not to say people don't do innovative thinking without diversity of thinking, but you get a value add when you deliberately attend to diversity of thinking as well. And also try and minimize risk. And so that's the group think piece. So if you do have diversity of thinking in a group, and this is research that was done by Professor Scott Page out of Michigan University, but you can reduce the error rate by about 30%. So, the variance that we've now talked about is plus 20% reduction of error by about 30%. So we've got 50% that we're playing with. And then the third thing, which I think it's hard to measure it, but it's what people told me, and that is that when there is diversity of thinking around a table, an executive table, a board table, people who are watching the decisions, or not even just watching the decisions, having to implement the decisions of that group, have greater faith and trust. So there is a higher level of followership in decisions that are made by diverse thinking groups than decisions which are made by effectively monocultures or mono-thinking.
That's interesting. And so good benefits in terms of more innovative thinking, reduction in risk, NLC followers having more trust, which is great. So if we go into how I can get more diversity thought into my current executive team or board, let's just assume that you have what you have in terms of the people on the team and you can't change them in the short term. What would be the first area you would look at to improve that diversity of thought?
I think executive teams and boards are similar in a way that you are having people around the table for their skills. That's the first thing. So you do want someone who brings finance to the table, who brings an understanding of processes and operationalizing things. If you think about the CFO, the COO, the CRO at executive level, maybe the CPO if you're executive level. And the same thing really at board level is you're trying to bring a diversity of skills to the table because those skills bring the ability to do a specific job. So diversity of thinking is on top of that. So you do have the people that you've selected because they have those skills and capabilities. And then you're sitting back from the group and thinking, okay, I have the right capabilities at the table from a technical perspective, but do we also have the ability to see a problem from different angles? Now, you might say, I do see a problem from different angles because people bring their technical expertise to that question. And that is true to a degree. Because what I found is that the more people become senior in an organization, the more they start to think the same. There's actually a pyramid in it in terms of the way they approach problems. And what I mean by that is that there are 6 potentially different ways to approach a problem. And that means what is the first question you ask, or what is the first contribution you make to a conversation, or what can you not let go of until it's answered? And some people are very outcomes oriented. So irrespective of if they're the CFO, the CEO, the CRO, irrespective of on the board, what skill base they come from, they're very much into what is it we're trying to achieve? What is our strategic objective? How close are we? And they will spend a lot of time trying to define that. And that's good to do that, but some people over-index on that. And what I found at the most senior levels of any organization is that there are more people who have an outcomes focus than there are the other focuses. But the second one that comes in is there are people who have an options focus. So they're not just, what is it that we're trying to achieve, but they'd rather have a conversation about what are the possibilities, like open it up a bit. What are the alternatives? How do we do it differently? So if you had those two people in a conversation around the exec table, you are getting two different perspectives. One is very, narrowly, sharply focused. What are we trying to achieve? Define. And the other one is opening it up. What are the alternatives? But there are 4 different ways of thinking about a problem. And those 4 different ways add value to that conversation. And we tend to under-index on those at senior levels. One is thinking about risk. What could go wrong? One is thinking about evidence. Do we have the data? How are we going to measure whether we're successful or not? One is process. How is this going to happen? And the last one is people. Do people have the capabilities, desire, motivation? So when you're in a conversation with people, it is not just that they're bringing a technical perspective to the table, but they're also bringing a lens on it, which is perhaps outcomes, perhaps options, perhaps people, process, risk, and evidence. And you really need all 6. And that is why you get the benefit of more innovation if you have that those 6 perspectives all in the room, and risk mitigation, and why you get greater followership because people perceive their voice is there. But your question to me also was, we have the team that we have, and how do I get more diversity of thinking into the group? So to answer that question, I would say, first of all, it's to know yourself. What of those 6, and this is the way that you sort of work it out, of those 6, which question would I ask so imagine yourself, you're in around a decision-making table, that you only get to ask one more question before the decision is made. Would you tend to ask one more question about outcomes or options or process, risk, evidence, or people if you only have one? So you've got a forced choice. Or you can ask other people, what do I always tend to talk about? That might give you a lens on what your default is in terms of problem solving. Because of course we can all do all 6, but we tend to do 1, maybe 2 more than we do the others. So you've got your group of people and they bring their technical capability, but you're wanting this value add as well. And you know yourself, I bring this to the table. And then you start to listen to other people. What do they always ask me about? So you start to see they have a lens. If I'm trying to build my profile of 6, they always have this lens, and that's a helpful lens to have. And if you don't have that lens at the table, then you can bring someone in, let's do it. Or you can get someone who, let's say, has a minor in one of these topics. It's not their primary way of thinking about it, but they tend to do it a little bit, and you can give more time to that voice within that room. So it is about understanding, listening to the group of people around you so that you are equalizing the amount of time that is spent on each of the 6, because even when I say it, I think we all intuitively know those 6 lenses on a decision are the difference between a complex decision being made well, more innovatively, and one which is going to have gaps in it, the risk.
Yeah. So this is really mainly focusing on the big strategic challenges, if you like, not necessarily every single problem, or is it useful for every single problem?
Well, what I would say with every single problem, I don't think you need to focus as much on diversity of thinking when you have a very simple thing. But the more complex a problem becomes, the more you need different perspectives to make sure that the innovation and error rate are addressed. If it's a simple problem and it doesn't really have much consequence to it, then you may not spend a lot of time thinking about diversity of thinking. But the more complex the problem is, and we all know that very many of the problems that come to an executive or a board are complex problems. So therefore, paying attention to diversity of thinking in a real way, not just, you know, that person, I think that person thinks differently to me, but now we have this sort of structure around it that we are saying, do I really have a people perspective around the table? Do I really have a process perspective, someone who's going to say, like, this is how we are going to do it? And if I don't, I need to address that, because I am building in problems in the solving of that complex problem.
Right. So what you're saying is build individual and potentially group awareness of which lenses you focus too much on, or which ones you don't focus on at all. And then, you know, I did this with a group of ex-colleagues, and I validated some of your work. The odd one had maybe evidence, but if you do have one person that may have one of these, are they likely to be drowned out if everyone's outcomes options? One person is process, or whether the group might sort of push them out of the way?
Exactly. And I think that's why knowing yourself, and yes, of course, if there's a collective in the group, and that's what I did find in this research, that at the bottom of organizations, it was more equally distributed. But as we got to the top, we tend to like people who are like ourselves, and that's a person who's outcome oriented or options oriented. So we get more of that as we go to the top. So we do drown their voices out. It's hard for that person who has a minority perspective to speak up. Although I did, when I was doing the research for the book, I did speak to someone who was the chief legal officer, and she said, I have an evidence-based perspective, and I may be only one person in that room, but I will be heard. Right. So we do get those characters who doesn't matter numbers. But I think what happens is we not only give less airtime to those different perspectives, because there's only one of them, and let's say there's 5 on another side. So obviously it's just a matter of numbers. But we also tend to give less weight to their perspective, because it's not our perspective. And so this is where bias comes into it. We tend to do confirmation bias, which is to want to hear the perspectives that confirm our existing point of view. And if we think the conversation should be about defining the outcomes more and more tightly, and someone keeps saying, how on earth can we define the outcomes when we don't even have any evidence to describe what we're looking at, then that view will not only be suppressed because it's just one person, but because the other people don't want to hear it. They want to hear more about defining the outcomes, however they define the outcomes.
Yeah. I've used in the past Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, which there is a little bit of similarity in terms of, you've got the process hat, you've got the the black hat, which is downside, which you could talk about risk. They're not all totally aligned, but there is some.
I did a mapping of it, of what he had done, and there was sort of a mapping of 4.5 over the 6. So he didn't do all of them. But I think that where Edward de Bono and I depart, though, is that he says you can learn to be all of those 6 in any given moment. And I do think we are all capable of learning to be those. But I would say we have all become, at this stage in our careers, masters at 1, maybe 2 of them. And so when someone else is a master in that perspective, so if someone else was a master in a risk perspective, I know the word risk and I can take the conversation a little way, but in the face of a master, I put my cards down and say, you lead the conversation. You have much more depth to it than I do. Whereas I think what Edward de Bono was saying, anyone can wear the black hat. And in fact, it's good for us to just give the black hat to someone in a meeting and say, you try now to be the person who embodies a risk perspective. Whereas I would say, go for the person who lives and breathes that perspective, irrespective of the hat you put on them. They are risk to the core, so let them be the authentic risk perspective. And the research backs what I suggest, people who authentically embody risk as opposed to synthetically by putting on a hat. The synthetic doesn't add as much value. Still adds some value, better than nothing, but doesn't add to the degree that someone authentically brings to the table.
So if you haven't got someone on the team and you don't know of someone with that sort of preference, or is it about just increasing your self-awareness and about asking questions relating to risk or people? Is that the next best thing that you can do?
And that's the synthetic option, where you don't really have a genuine understanding of it, but you're going to ask yourself a series of questions. What will happen, though, is that, say, for example, you have a people orientation, really, and you synthetically try to do risk. You will ask all of the risk questions aligned to people.
Right.
That's what you'll do, because you can't be a purist in that risk space. So better than nothing to have a list of questions, because you want to create that innovative outcome, reduce risk, and greater followership. Better still to go and test it afterwards, once you've made a tentative decision with someone who really embodies that risk profile, which would be the question, what have I missed from this? If I was to bring a risk lens to this conversation or this potential decision, what questions would you be asking?
Yeah, okay, that's clear. When thinking about renewal of a board or executive team for succession of the future, most teams will have think about diversity, the experience, the function, male, female, as key areas to identify successors. How would you, or how have you, sort of revolutionized the skills matrix to be more useful and to bring in more of this thinking?
The skills matrix is a good place to start, and obviously also thinking about attributes of people, their openness. I talked before in the 4 things that you think about, understanding your biases and being an inclusive member of that team or an inclusive leader. That's a characteristic. But the skills matrix is still a good place to start, because it helps you with different lenses. We do tend to over-index on people from financial backgrounds on boards, if we're going to just to a boards conversation, and that is already narrowing the scope of the discussion, and it's probably just bringing in potentially 2 ways of thinking about things, which is risk and evidence. And we can see that if you don't have people there with either a human capital lens, that could be a discipline in customer or marketing, or a discipline in human resources, it's likely that we're not going to get a human perspective in those discussions. So people was one of the 6. There is a bit of an overlap between the 2, but I think it's almost like a decision making when you have the difference between 2 people. You've done your skills matrix and you realize we need to broaden out skills on the board, and then you're listening to someone and you're listening for, is this person, although let's just say they're a human capital kind of person, although you're expecting them to bring human capital to the table, actually they're just bringing outcomes, and because you are yourself are outcomes oriented. So one of the biases is to recruit in your own image. And so notwithstanding that you've gone through the skill matrix, and notwithstanding that you're trying to listen for difference, your default is actually to recruit someone who seems to be people oriented, but actually is very outcomes oriented. So it is about skills, of course, but it is about having this lens on top of that. Can I hear them bringing a genuinely different perspective to the table if I have a choice between 2 people, 2 candidates, for example?
Right. So when you're interviewing, it's actually thinking about the language that they use.
Yeah, the language, the examples that they bring to the table. Of course, they're going to try and speak to a number of different things, but what does it come back to for them? What are their greatest achievements? Do they talk about how they did something? Maybe they're very process oriented, or what they achieved. They might be very outcomes oriented, or opening up opportunities. A variety of different things that might be there, more options oriented. So I do think you can develop a sensitivity to the way that someone talks and the examples that they use, and it helps you understand the perspective that they bring.
Yeah, okay. The other area you talk about in your book is about unconscious bias. So some people might think that because they're unconscious, how will I know what I don't know? I my blind spots. You talk specifically about three main ones to be aware of: homophily, which is being drawn to people like yourself; confirmation bias, seeking and drawing on information that confirms your current beliefs; and cognitive decline, which was an interesting one. Your ability to make good quality decisions declines the more decisions you make or the more energy you expend or start with due to emotional drain, poor sleep, lack of glucose, whatever. So how do we firstly go about understanding our blind spots and biases, and then some ways of combating those?
I mean, a very easy way to do it is ask those people who know you well, because other people can see our biases more easily, more quickly than we can see ourselves. So you could ask them in relation to homophily, which is homo meaning same, phily meaning love. Who are the kinds of people that we seem to be drawn to, or we could look at our circle of friends and we might be able to see something when we stand back from that circle. What do they all seem to have in common? Are they all creatives, or are they all, are they all drawn from accounting? Do they have some sort of background to them? Are they all of a certain age and sort of demographic profile? So we are
on that, just to sort of, sorry, interrupting on that, wouldn't you naturally be, people's friends are going to be naturally drawn to people?
That's the whole point. Naturally is your bias.
Yeah.
Right. There is no natural in here. You select. You come in contact with a wide group of people.
Yeah.
Who are the people that you then say, hey, do you want to catch up for a coffee?
Right.
They're the people that, unless you work on it, are going to be, because your bias is to connect with people to whom you are more similar than different. So if you genuinely want to connect with people who are very different to you, you really have to turn to the person to the left of you, really, and say, oh, that your background sounds so interesting. I haven't met anyone like you before. Can we catch up for coffee? But that's not our default. Our default is to,
right.
Yeah. So yes, we are looking at the feathers around us, those birds, the collective, and seeing what is the commonality between them. So awareness is the first one, but then overcoming that bias is also about putting in place structures so that we try to lean into that less. So if you were doing an interview for a board position, taking another board member with you who is very different to you, who is going to bring a very different angle, rather than someone who's going to confirm your bias to replicate yourself.
Yeah. So that's a homophily. Confirmation bias, is that really just, in terms of understanding that, is that just being aware of what you're drawn to in terms of opinions, or where you
source information?
Right.
For example, how much time you give to that information. It's very hard to overcome confirmation bias, because it is the bias not only to confirm a position that we already hold, so keeping yourself open to going in a different way, but it's all tied up in an emotional red bow, because it's not an intellectual thing. We want to be right, and so we have to find ways of deliberately opening ourselves to a wider variety of information. So for example, if you are going to your news sources, to what degree do you read a left-wing news source or a right-wing news source? And do you read them in equal measure? Or do you tend to over-index on one? When you do get information which contradicts your point of view, to what degree do you nitpick it so that it will, die the death of 1,000 cuts? So you're over analyzing things which contradict your point of view. Whereas if something is similar to your point of view, you let it through the gate quickly because it's just confirming. So we can do different ways of challenging diverse thinking, which means that the diverse point of view will never get through as equally as the other point of view. So it is about how, what information do you let in, And then when you let it in, how do you stay open to really understanding that perspective? Can you play it back to the other person so that they genuinely are? Apparently Obama used to do this. He used to genuinely seek, when he was president, a different point of view and then play it back and forth until he really captured it. And it is about having that perspective on it. You don't have to agree with it, but do I really understand it? Charles Darwin said he used to go out and deliberately read research that was different to his own perspective. And he says that that's why On the Origin of Species was so successful. And it nearly wasn't, because there was a theory about selection that he quickly dismissed because it was like an earworm that got in and then he rejected it. And so he had a sort of pivotal moment of learning about the risk associated with confirmation bias, but then overcoming it was part of his success.
Yeah, I think the other one you mentioned in the book was Warren Buffett likes to get someone to take an opposite point of view to, what
Well,
he's
he does it in a really interesting way, because he invites that person who's got a contrary point of view to sit next to him at a public event. And so people are hearing these two perspectives, but he himself is compelling himself to listen to someone. And so that, I mean, he's been obviously very successful as well. And that is about making sure that you are not just in your echo chamber, that you are putting yourself in the way of and spending more time listening to views that disrupt your own. And it maybe at the end of the day, you say there's a good reason why I'm not accepting it, but you've got to spend more attention to that different perspective.
So practically for this, you could, if you're going through a change program, you could look at, who's resisting this change, who's the person who's very anti what we're doing, or if you've got a stakeholder that is, remember when I was at Mars, we had Greenpeace that we would talk to, they're very anti what we're doing, but it was different opinions. You're never going to be on the same page as them, but you want to hear their perspective.
Yeah, and give respect to that perspective. That perspective is meaningful for that person, so not just dismissive. If you're on a board, it's about understanding investor perspectives. Why do they have that point of view, and giving them respect for the fact that they might have thought deeply about it, just not the way that you think about it. So yes, spending more time with the difficult stakeholder with genuine curiosity. Why is it that you think this way? And it may shift your perspective. And even if it doesn't, you have a much greater depth of knowledge about how to interact with that person.
Yeah. And lastly, just coming on to cognitive decline, because I hadn't heard.
It's cognitive depletion.
Sorry.
Cognitive decline is something that happens with senility, but this is cognitive depletion.
Right.
Yeah, that is something that happens to us every day. So we wake up in the morning with, a sort of full capacity may need a coffee to help stimulate, but we've got a lot of capacity. And then as the day goes on and we've made decision after decision after decision, then our ability to make complex decisions, attend to information which is contrary to our own point of view is significantly diminished. So you can prop it up a bit. That's why we say, let's have a coffee, let's go for a walk. You can prop it up a bit during the day. But effectively, what you need to do every night is go to sleep, because that is the restorative way that our brains replenish. But it is one of those things that, because humans have come to believe that we're superhuman, that we can keep on going on the smell of an oily rag, we keep on pushing ourselves to make decisions under suboptimal condition. And we contribute to those suboptimal decisions by, at the end of the day, having a glass of wine and making a decision. And a glass of wine reduces your capacity even more because it chews up glucose. So what this means is that, and it is hard to put into practice, because sometimes you just have to make a decision at the end of the day. Sometimes global calls happen at the end of the day, but it is, to the degree possible, reducing the decisions that you have to make so there's fewer of them. So for example, very tactical one, Mark Zuckerberg only wears grey t-shirts, and that is because he is reducing one choice, which is, what do I wear today? And the more that you can routinize your day, the more you are saving your brain for the decisions that actually require more attention. Whereas if you every day is a new set of decisions about minutiae, then you're just burning through your energy.
Right. And obviously trying to put, assuming you've got good sleep, the most important decisions at the front of the agenda and when you've got the most.
Exactly. Exactly. So as a result of reading all of this research now, I leave the question about, the minutes from the last meeting, are they approved? That is actually the last item on my agenda.
Right.
Rather than having a big discussion up. So I try and push the difficult discussions up front when I'm setting the agenda as a chair, and I'll leave that little one for the end. And I'll also create space for some free time thinking on an agenda. So it's not crammed with decisions, but we actually have some space on our agenda to do some 10 minutes of the free flow.
Right. Okay. That's good. And then lastly, in your book, you talk about the need for inclusive leaders and leadership groups and understanding where you are in that maturity. So can you explain the 3 maturity steps in inclusion so that listeners can get a view of where their team's at?
Yeah, so you think of it as a staircase. So what does inclusion mean? The first part is where you are just allowing people to participate in a conversation. So just treating them fairly and respectfully, courteously, you invite them to a meeting. That is a low level of inclusion, but just having someone at the table is at least an inclusion. They receive the email which says, come to this meeting. But then the second part of it is when they're in the meeting, you understand the value that they are contributing, you understand their uniqueness, and there is a sense of connectivity between people that you are trying to create. So they're not just present, but you say, oh, Juliet, you're here at this meeting. I know you have a perspective on this topic. Please speak up. So it's a higher level of inclusion. And then the last level of inclusion is where you are trying to create psychological safety so that it's not just the person's present and not just that they're known to you at a deeper level, but you are allowing them to contribute ideas that are risky in some ways. And that is really where, diversity of thinking is going to be enlivened, because it is different, it is disruptive potentially to the group. So the highest order of inclusion is where a person who has a different point of view feels comfortable speaking up, knowing that they won't be ejected by the group, that their inclusion is not contingent upon saying the same thing as everyone else. And then they're starting to bring more of their perspectives to the group. So 3 levels: fairness and respect, right, just getting in, then this sort of value and belonging, and then this high level of, I'm creating the space around me so that someone who has a different point of view, bless you, will be able to speak up.
So moving from level 2 to level 3 is quite a shift in terms of, one is about you valuing them and understanding what they bring. The third one about psychological safety. How do you do that, when you have people coming into the group who may not come in very often?
Well, you've got perspectives on this, don't you? Do you think you should share your perspective first?
I suppose my perspective around psychological safety is firstly the vulnerability of the leader and how you because someone new coming to the table or into the room who doesn't know the group, you've got to firstly show some vulnerability yourself. Otherwise, no one's going to show vulnerability to you. So to me, I think that's one of the most important things, and probably setting them up prior to the meeting is a really important. If they come in cold and they don't know people, I think that's going to be really hard, whatever you do in the meeting. So I think setting them up for success and understanding, your expectations of them and what you want from them and what they need from you. So to me, it's that relationship building prior to, as well as helping them feel comfortable and showing that the group are vulnerable and open and really eager to understand, your point of view. So
yeah, I think those are two really great pieces of advice. I think things you can do from a physical perspective, or if we're online from a virtual perspective, is making sure you're giving time to that person. So directing some attention, giving them some space. I heard about a leader who, knowing that there was a new person coming in, this was a physical meeting, sat the person next to them. So they were sort of appropriating some of that leadership power. They were not sort of off in the corner. But I think you're right around the sort of humility and vulnerability, as that is a very much a secret sauce that leaders have. The degree to which you yourself express some openness creates the environment for other people. The degree to which you own mistakes, the degree to which you lead with an open question as opposed to a closed question, those things all allow the new person. And as soon as the new person, and this is what always happens in groups, the new person will test the waters as to whether they can say something slightly controversial. It's got to really be embraced, because we don't go for the big disclosure straight up. We test it out. And so the moment that someone does that, thank you so much for bringing that up. Hadn't thought about but like that before. Really interesting. Give me some time and I'll think about it. But I think endorsing that person's effort early on will mean that they will try again with something more meaningful to them. They usually don't speak up about something highly meaningful first go, something that's less risk attached.
right. We've got a question here, which I want to ask, which does link into this. This is Anna. Thanks, Anna, for the question. I'd love to hear more about the higher level of fellowship theme that Juliet spoke about in her opening comments. I'm guessing that organisational cultures with higher levels of fellowship also enable more open executive team / board member communications, so the members of the executive team individually or with colleagues lead more difficult conversations with the board that may progress and require board decisions.
Yeah, so Anna, that's a really great question. And let me just situate my perspective on that and then go to try and answer it for you. What I was talking about in particular was when a leadership team addresses the 6 different ways of thinking about a problem in their communications, and when an outsider can see that those 6 different perspectives have been taken into consideration in some way because they're talking about it, or because the decision of obviously reflects those 6, then the person sitting outside of the group is more likely to follow that decision because they can see themselves represented in that conversation. So, for example, if you have someone outside of the group who is very interested in how are we going to implement this decision, and when the decision is communicated, the leader is saying, and here's how we're going to do it, then that follower is more likely to say, well, that was a good decision because my voice is reflected. And indeed, I saw a chief transformation officer do this. She was leading a conversation, a town hall conversation, in which she was talking about the strategy, and she had read my book, and she told me that she then addressed all 6 points or all 6 perspectives when talking about the strategy. So she talked about the outcome, she talked about the options, she talked about process, evidence, risk, and people. And so the 1,000 people who were listening to her were more on board with that decision because each person could see themselves in the consideration. That's where I was going to here. But your question was sort of slightly different to that. And maybe they do, higher levels of followership also does have this higher levels of openness, which is what Gerry was just talking about then. I think you're probably right about that people are more likely to follow decisions where there is a greater level of transparency around things, if that's where you were going to. I would agree with that. I was also trying to make this point that followership is enhanced, thanks Anna, when you address all 6, because it goes to the variety of stakeholders that you're trying to influence.
Yeah, and it probably links back to the psychological safety you talked about. If an executive team get knocked back or not recognised for their contribution, then they're probably less likely to come with more, difficult conversations to the board.
That's right.
They'll come with safer ones. So it probably links to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last couple of questions I've got here. I see many teams that use psychological profiling tools, and I've been through many myself, where sometimes you feel like you put in a box and you tell people, if you want to deal with that person, here's the approach. You deal with them this way.
Yeah.
I suppose, how useful or valid are they? I mean, do they have a role, and what role should we use them for?
I mean, look, there is a range. There are some of those profiles that have a great deal of recognition in our communities, but they actually don't have a lot of validity to them. So they might roll off our tongue, this sort of test, but now people in psychology would say that's not the one we should be using anymore. So psychological profiling is in itself a contested area. Psychologists would think about big five in terms of personality, and they do have validity to them, greater validity than some of the other tests. If I think about the contribution that I have made, people thinking about things in 6 different ways, I would say, first of all, these are not immutable characteristics. We have learnt to think about that. We weren't born thinking about things in a particular way, but we've grown up, because I could see people change over time. Remember the hierarchy? As people got more and more senior, their thinking tended to sort of compress into more just options and outcomes, but they didn't start that way because that was what was valued in that environment. So I think in terms of profiling, if we understand that it is fluid, it is not you're in this box and you're in this box forever. And then secondly, I mean, I don't like being put into a box either, but what I do want people to understand with the way that I think about things and bring it to the table is that is my strength. I have a certain way of thinking about a problem that I think is valuable to a group. And also I put my cards down when someone else can think much more deeply in a way. So I don't want to put them into a box they don't want to be in, but if they're happy to be the person who has a stronger risk bone in them than I do, or a stronger process bone in them than I do, then I'm very happy to say, this appears to be a strength for you. Do you think it's a strength for you? If it is a strength for you, then I will defer to you in terms of making final decisions in that way. So I think we've got to hold those profiles lightly and test whether they have recognized validity from other people.
Yeah. And last question. So you talked about the 6 traits of inclusive leadership. So curiosity, cultural intelligence, collaborative, commitment, courage, and cognizance. We haven't got time to go through every one of those, but I'd like to just touch on curiosity and courage. Can you tell me more about what an inclusive leader would typically be doing in these areas and what people can do to build muscles in those?
All right. So courage is actually the courage to be humble and the courage to be vulnerable. It is not bravery. That comes under commitment. So that's a different type of behavior that inclusive leaders do. But the courage to be humble is that one that you talked about, where you are talking about your limitations. I know this, but I don't know that. Or you're talking about mistakes that you have made. So you're trying to create an environment in which other people can see the value that they can contribute to that. Curiosity is about someone generally being very open-minded, but open-minded in a bigger way, which is just, my door's always open, but really going out and seeking diverse perspectives, dealing well with ambiguity. When we are in situations that are ambiguous to us, all of us have a bias to close down, and because humans like certainty. And so the bias to closure. So it is holding yourself open to hear those different perspectives for it longer. And then the last part of curiosity is really this empathy and perspective taking. So not just understanding someone's point of view intellectually, but also emotionally. What's driving that? And a very good question that you can ask people about that is, when you get to the point at which, almost that point where the person's annoying you with their different perspective, instead of closing it down, you just ask one more time, tell me more. And so that tell me more is a strategic question to keep it pushing that conversation open just 1 second longer. And I often find people will say things to me in the last 5 minutes of a conversation. So I actually listen harder in some ways at the end of the conversation, because people are comfortable then. And that's when they'll tell me the thing that they've been waiting to tell me the whole time. But I have to leave enough room at the end of the conversation for the 5-minute bit of gold.
Right, excellent. Right, so thank you, Dr. Juliet, for your time and expertise. Before everyone goes, I'd love you to fill in a short survey. It's 2 questions, which will help us ensure we get the right topics for the future. So it's in the chat box now. But thank you for your time. I really enjoyed that. So diversity of thinking, thinking about the visible and invisible, I took out of that. So visible, what sits around the table, and then invisible, how people are approaching problems. Benefits, obviously, innovative thinking, improving, reducing risks, and also other stakeholders having a higher level of trust. 4 areas of to think about are the composition of the group, the structure, which we have conversations in, mitigating biases that limit our perspective, and inclusive leadership, which we touched on. Thinking about how the group goes about solving big problems, so individually becoming more self-aware of your 1 or 2 priorities or go-tos. And if you understand that and around the group, you can call on people who can balance out the ways of thinking in the group, which I touched on. Thinking about the skills matrix as being a start point, a good start point, but making sure that you hear when you're interviewing people, their perspectives. If they're talking about their greatest achievements, are they talking about outcomes? Are they talking about the process? Are they talking about evidence, etc.? So you can learn from that to make sure you're getting the right people. Your biases, making sure that you're asking people who know you well, thinking about what you are drawn to, thinking about trying to get people with a different opinion to you, and even though it might feel uncomfortable, is someone who will challenge you. I think that's a really, really good point of view and practice. And then around inclusion is thinking about not just having people in your meeting, thinking about what they bring, how you're valuing them, and then how you're making them feel safe so that they can contribute. Then the other areas around the parts of inclusive leadership, we just touched on courage. So really thinking about how you are bringing your vulnerability to the team, how you're bringing your curiosity, so how you're seeking diverse views, how you're making sure that when you feel uncomfortable that you need to close something, then keep it open a little bit longer. Ask that, tell me more. So thank you very much. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate any feedback you've got, and thank you very much, Dr. Juliet. Really insightful. And if anyone wants to get a book, I would recommend it. So I'm probably going to get the title wrong. 2 heads are better than 1.
Which 2 heads?
Which 2 heads are better than 1?
Almost. You're not alone.
Oh, that's right. But some really great insights and tips. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet everyone.
And look forward to seeing you next time, everyone. We've got a webinar with Mike Bennett, who was the CEO of Z Energy, around leadership. So that's in a month's time. So look out for that one. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
Bye.
See you. Bye.